Okay, so I want to finish up a little bit just talking about what is traditional Asian thought and talk about something that's a little bit possibly controversial, and that is something that people have talked about in Western religions, that in Western religions, the immediate experience of what we might call, use a fancy word, numinosity. Anybody ever heard this word, numinosity, numinous? What does numinous mean? It's a word that means godlike or an experience of God or experience of sort of a higher power. Something that is beyond just your own individual sense of the world. You feel the presence of something bigger, you feel the presence of something outside yourself. So numinous and numinosity. So one thing that's been talked about in Western religions, and by Western I mean, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, is that people have felt like these religions have lost some of their numinous power. In other words, that the direct experience of coming into contact with God or a higher power has been watered down to some degree over the years. And this is, you can see this in the sense, and again, I don't mean this as a criticism, but you can see this in the sense of monastic traditions, that in Western religions, that monastic traditions are really not very central anymore, right? This is, if you think about, like, for instance, the Catholic Church, which I'll use a lot as examples in this class. The Catholic Church has had a long history of having a monastic tradition where there were monasteries and people went off to monasteries and became monks or nuns and lived in these places and lived a life of contemplation. When I was much younger, around your guys' age, after I graduated from college, I went and lived in Italy for a while. And I lived in Italy, and there were monasteries everywhere. Every town had its own monastery. Lots of the towns were built around monasteries to provide services for the monks or the nuns who were there. And these were, it was kind of a major institution. We don't really see that much anymore in Western society. It's not as prevalent as it used to be. And the monks and nuns being people who supposedly would go out and have a sort of direct encounter with God, with spiritual beings, with spiritual power, and then channel that down to the common people, the lay people. And what's happened now, according to some people, and again, I don't mean this as a criticism, is that Western religions have been watered down to some degree. That we don't really have this. We go to church, we might sing some hymns, we might pray, but we don't really have that ongoing feeling of numinosity, encounter with numinosity. And what's happened in the West, especially in California, is that we now have to seek that out, to seek that experience out. We've now looked to the East. We now look to Asian religions who have come over to the West. Asian religions, many of which do not have these sort of traditions of church structures that you have to go through. Now, in Catholicism, I'm sure there's lots of Catholics in here, right? A lot of you guys Catholic. What happens in Catholicism, right? You make a supplication to God. You go through basically channels, right? It's like if I want to talk to the president of the university here. I don't know the new president. I knew the old president. The old president, I could just get on the phone and call him up directly. I knew him personally. Hey, I want to meet with you. Let's talk about something, right? He'd say, okay, I've got some time. Come and see me Tuesday at 8 in the morning or something, right? I could do that. Now I don't know the new president. She seems like a very nice lady, but I know nothing about her. So if I want to talk to her, I will have to call, and I'll have to call her secretary. I'll probably have to call the dean first and make sure that's okay with him, and then I've got to make sure the dean's okay with the provost, and I got to call the provost, and then the provost or somebody's secretary will go and talk to the president's secretary, and they'll say, what does he want to talk to this person about? And they'll come back to me and say, what do you want to talk to the president about? We want to make sure you're not going to just go there and harangue her or waste her time, and then I'll have to go back through channels again. I have to go through channels to get to the higher powers, supposedly, right? That's the metaphor, right? And so the idea in Western religions now is that we essentially have to go through these sort of higher, these channels to get to the higher power. And in the Catholic Church, this was very well codified, right? First of all, you go up through the channels to your local priest, who then goes to the bishop, who then goes to the archbishop, who then goes to Rome, and then goes to the Pope, and then the Pope, is appointed by God, and then stuff comes back down, and then there's a connection made, right? And you also have, even in the sort of spiritual pantheon, the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary was known as the cosmic mediatrix, right? The cosmic mediatrix, the mediator between the cosmos. And she's like the cosmic switchboard operator. You guys know, back in the day, before things were digital, you know, back in the 30s and 40s, when you made a phone call, you know, you wanted to make a long-distance call, you call into the operator, they would have to connect you to the party somewhere else, right? It was a whole thing. We didn't have digital switching and all those things now. And the Virgin Mary has that little bit of that function, right? A little bit of that function. But there, you know, but what you find is that people want to have the direct connection. And so what you find is that people find ways around, you know, going through the channels, right? So I want to talk to the president. I just figure out what time she leaves her office and walks out to her car, and then I just walk out to the car and say, oh, by the way, President Beck, I'm Kevin, and I just wanted to let you introduce myself, and, you know, right? And I go around all those channels, and I do it that way. Hopefully it's not considered to be some form of stalking. She doesn't start screaming and spray me with mace and call the police. But this is also what you see in, you know, people, you know, one idea is that people have a need for this sort of spiritual connection, whether it's God or a higher power or something outside of ourselves or bigger than ourselves. And so what you find is that people will find a way around the structure, right? I lived in Italy for a while. In Italy, it was very interesting how people did this, is that at the end of the block where I lived, and you saw this in many blocks, and there may be, this may also be true in other Latin countries, I don't know, but in Italy, at the end of the block, there was a shrine on the street, built into the sort of like a brick wall. It was like a little concave thing, and it was the Black Madonna, the Black Virgin Mary, you know, very dark in color. And then, you know, there's a little shrine there, and people kept candles lit, and they put flowers there. And, you know, anybody in the neighborhood, you needed to make a direct connection. Rather than go through the church and the priest or everything, you know, something was going on, somebody in your family was sick, you had some problem, you know, you couldn't come up with the rent money, there was an issue, you didn't go to the church. You didn't go to the priest and talk to people, or maybe you did that, but you also wanted the direct connection. You would go down to the little altar at the end of the block, and you would pray to the Virgin Mary directly, and have her directly intercede for you. Okay, and so there's, again, you see this, you know, this need for this direct connection. Now, also, we could also talk about the idea that the feminine versus the masculine, that the church structure is very masculinized, and people have a need for connecting to the goddess, to the feminine. And so they make these little shrines and things like this. And I know other people, I've had people in this class before tell me that they have these kind of things like in Latin America and in Brazil and places like that. You can also see these kind of little Virgin Mary shrines. But this is your way to have a direct connection, right? But, you know, we see around here, we don't really have that as much. So one thing about California, because we have such an influence from Asia, what you see is a lot of Californians becoming interested in Asian cultures, because Asian religions tend to, and again, I'm generalizing here, they tend to provide a little bit more direct connection to the numinous. Okay? That there's not a lot of church structure. There's just you sitting down, usually doing some form of meditation or prayer, and just going directly to that experience of that higher power, that being, whatever it may be, without a church structure having to intervene for you. It's not that those church structures don't exist. They do in some cases. In some cases, they're really almost non-existent. But there tends to be a little more emphasis on direct experience with the spiritual realm, and that you, in some of these Asian religions, especially Buddhism, you have to make the effort. It really is incumbent on you to make the effort as an individual to make this experience happen. And in other traditions, you know, like Hinduism, you know, maybe there's a different way that you make the effort. Maybe it's not so much on you. And then Taoism is going to be a little bit all over the map. And again, I'll talk about that later, because Taoism is a little bit of everything. Okay? But this idea that people from the West are drawn to Asian religions because they can make this direct contact with the numinous is an interesting idea. And again, I don't mean that as a put down of Western religions. Okay? And we could talk about all sorts of things about how Western religions are in some ways, you know, superior to some of the Asian religions. You guys may have heard of the Dalai Lama. You guys know the Dalai Lama? He's the head of the Tibetan Buddhists. He's become quite an international sort of celebrity figure because he won the Nobel Prize in 1989. And, people think of him as the head of all Buddhists. He's not really, but he does speak this Buddhist message. And he was meeting one time with the Pope. I think it was the Pope previous to this one. He was meeting with the Pope, and he was noticing about all the Christian outreach, that Christians were actually going out and setting up soup kitchens and actually feeding people. And he was very, very impressed with that. And he said, wow, as Buddhists, we just sit around and meditate for people and pray for people, but you Christians, you're actually going out there and cooking soup and feeding people. And he goes, that's really impressive. We should do more of that. We Buddhists should do more of that. So again, I want to be clear here to you guys, because I'm assuming most of you are probably Christians, that I'm not playing favorites here. There's good things about all religions. Okay? There's probably bad things about all religions too. Okay? There's good and bad things about all religions. Okay, so I want to be clear about that. But this is one thing that I think, if you talk to a lot of Westerners who become involved in Eastern religions, this is one of the things you'll hear. They want a direct connection to this sort of spiritual realm. And you'll see other religions, especially, and I mentioned here a little bit specifically Judaism. Judaism has a very interesting history with Asian religions, especially with Buddhism. That if you look at, go out and you do a poll of, for instance, Americans who have adopted Buddhism as their religion, you'll find that a good proportion of these folks have a Judaic background. And it's very interesting, and there may be some reasons for that. And one is that both Buddhism and Judaism have a history of asking questions, of questioning authority, of questioning the dogma of the religion. And in Judaism, they have the Talmud, where you're writing all these questions and having a debate about things that are in the Old Testament and in the Bible, and there's a long tradition of that. And in Buddhism, the same thing. And when we talk about Tibetan Buddhism, remind me to talk to you about how Tibetans debate, religious points. They have a whole debate system. It's very interesting how they do it. They do it. It's like a debate. I mean, they actually sit there and somebody will propound a point, and the other guy will try to hit them on the point, and they'll actually go back. There's a lot of back and forth, and they have this whole system of questioning things. And of course, the Buddha most famously himself uttered the phrase, question everything. Question everything. Don't accept things just on dogma, but actually question it. Okay? Do a little experiment for yourself to see if what I say is true. Right? That's very rare in most religions. Okay? Most religions, it's like, God said this, so you better just believe it, right? Buddhism and Judaism, more of a tradition of questioning. And so they share this, and I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of Jewish people get interested in Buddhism, because it's another tradition that allows them to question things. I think that's a comfortable place to be.
I have a question.
Yes.
You presented a lecture by Joseph Campbell on Blackboard, and my question relates to that. I think it has to do with this too, what you're talking about.
Yes.
He divided the religions in half, the Eastern and the Western, and then each one of those he divided in half, with the West being the Greek Promethean,
yes,
and the servant side with the Judaism and Islamic traditions, and then the Hindu, and then the Taoism or the
yeah,
right?
yeah.
My question to you is, how do you reconcile with yourself the more Promethean Western Greek ideas of the West and you being a Taoist?
That's a very good question. And let me first answer it by saying I don't really consider myself a Taoist. I think officially, personally, I consider myself to be a Buddhist. But I have lots of Taoist leanings, let's put it that way. So I guess I'm somewhere between a Buddhist and a Taoist, and it's a very good question because those distinctions between what you're saying, what Campbell calls Promethean and let's just say non-Promethean, actually also exist in Asian religions. Okay, and Buddhism is a good example. Buddhism can be seen on the surface level as being very Promethean. And we'll talk, I think, at the end of today or next time, we'll talk a little bit about the hero myth. And you guys are reading that little excerpt from The Hero of a Thousand Faces, right? And this idea of the hero who descends into the underworld and brings, it has a transformation, fights the monster, and then comes to the light and brings this new insight to people and changes things, even though they themselves are changed. This is a myth in our culture that permeates and marinates our culture. And it's a myth that is especially pronounced in, I would say, my opinion is, especially pronounced in Christianity and Islam, and I think also probably to a large degree also Judaism. I might disagree a little bit with Joseph Campbell, and I do disagree with Joseph Campbell in some points. But these are Promethean things. And what you see in these sort of religions is there are a couple ideas. One is that you are going to get the reward later. Right, you're a good Christian. You go out, you proselytize, you convert people, you live a good life. You do all these things. You follow the word of the Bible. You do what God says, and then when you die, you get your rewards. You go to heaven, right? And there's versions of this in Islam. You've heard all the sort of popularized stuff, that they talk about. Yeah, I went out and martyred myself and blew up people in the shopping mart because I knew I was going to get 72 virgins after I died. What that guy's going to do with 72 virgins, I don't know. But, these kind of things. These are very heroic, even though it's a negative. There's a negative overlay on that last example. It's still a heroic myth, right? And these hero myths. And you see in Buddhism the same thing. I'm going to get enlightened. I'm going to go sit under the tree, and I'm not getting up until I get enlightened, right? I'm going to get this hero stuff, and then I'm going to put in all this effort. And even in Buddhism, a lot of forms of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism especially, I'm going to work on enlightenment my whole life, and then at the moment of death, I have my chance to get enlightened, right? I'm going to get my reward at the end. And so we see there's some similarity there. And then you see other religions like Hinduism. And Hinduism's there is some of that. There's a branch of Hinduism where you have some of that. And then there's a branch of Hinduism where, you have no idea. You're on this wheel of life and you're trying to get off, and you know what? You're making all this effort. Don't bother. Eventually everybody's going to get off. Just do your best. And it's not quite the same. And then you got Taoism, where you have things like Wu Wei, action without action, where the way to really achieve salvation is not to die and ascend to heaven, but the way to achieve salvation is to be between heaven and earth in your appropriate balanced place, right? Now, Taoism also, we're going to learn in this class, has the other stuff too. Taoism has everything, which is why I really like Taoism. So you can say I'm a Buddhist, and as a Buddhist, I'm this kind of Taoist. Right? Taoism can be the big container for the other religions. You can even say I'm a Christian, and therefore, because I practice this kind of Christianity, you can see this in the context of Taoism. I'm going to get to that later. That's a little more complicated. But the idea that there are these different ways of dividing the religions up, to me is, I think Joseph Campbell does a good service by helping us analyze these things by making these distinctions. But I think once you start looking more closely, the distinctions start to break down.
I think my question also is the concept of it, meaning if I think the Dalai Lama speaks directly about the East also, much like Joseph Campbell has a way of looking at things, and the West has a way of looking at things too, right?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure he speaks, if I can remember correctly, some of my reading. But what I'm asking is, I understand there's a dichotomy, and then paradoxes can bring those dichotomies together, but the Promethean idea to me, when I think in the West, we're looking towards the East, but I think we're missing out on that kind of tragic hero numinosity of the Promethean thing, where it's the tragic standing up to the gods for that moment is the gift.
Yeah, I mean, so what I'm going to say is that if you look at Eastern stuff a little more closely, you will also find that Promethean myth. You're bringing light, and the Promethean myth also is related to things like worship of Apollo, worship of light, right? Rational versus the irrational. And somebody like the Dalai Lama is a great example. This is a guy who's been saying Buddhism is like science, and we need to apply a scientific method to things. And when the scientific method shows us this kind of truth, we need to abandon our earlier beliefs. He's come out and said that, and some Buddhists don't like that. But he himself is very very comfortable with that, I guess we can call it a Promethean tradition. He doesn't see any contradiction in incorporating that into his Asian system of belief. He likes science, and Buddhism is very friendly to science in this way, in general. So you'll find it, when you go scratch the surface, you'll find the Promethean stuff in the East too. Okay, there may be some little variations, changes, but you'll find it there. And I assume also in the West, and I don't know enough about Western religions to really be able to comment on this, but if you scratch the surface enough in Western religions, you'll also find some of that non-Promethean stuff as well, maybe a little bit more buried. And that's my point, really. That, it's there, the monastic traditions, the experiential traditions are there in the Western religions. They're just a little bit more buried. And if you look into Judaism, for instance, and you study Kabbalah, or you look at this Islamic tradition of Sufism, right? The Sufis, you start reading some Sufi stuff, you might think you're reading, stuff from a Zen Buddhist. It starts, they're really talking about direct experience, like not having to have some heroic thing and go into light. So it's there. It's just a little bit, I'm talking about propensities. Western religions tend to have more propensities toward that Promethean rational view, and Eastern religions tend to have maybe some more propensities toward, the sort of direct experience. But there is a lot, once you dig through the surface, there's lots of, it's a much more mixed up, complicated picture. Joseph Campbell likes to simplify things. And when you read Joseph Campbell's books, he likes to simplify things. And he likes to simplify things into the hero myth. And he's been roundly criticized for that by other psychologists. For instance, James Hillman is a Jungian psychologist who's criticized this sort of marination of our society, and especially of psychology, in the hero myth, and is asking us to take a more multi-viewpoint take on, at least in his case, psychology, right? The hero myth is fine, but it's just one type of viewpoint. There's other viewpoints as well. There's other myths. So you got Prometheus here, but you also have a myth of Hades over here. You have a myth of, the Taoist immortal over here. You have the myth of the trickster over here, Native American tradition like Coyote. Those are all valid points. They're just as valid as the hero myth, but we just focused on the hero myth. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that when we talk about, I'll talk briefly about Joseph Campbell. So remind me about that. But I think it's a very good question. And so something I think I would ask you, keep this idea of these dichotomies, these differences in mind throughout the course when we're talking about things. And then, like the Buddha said, don't take it from what I'm telling you, just test it out for yourself. So I talk about Hinduism, say how much of this is Promethean, how much of this is something else. Right, and you can just sort of see for yourself. And I think you'll see a little bit of a mixture in there. Okay? When we get to Taoism, I will directly talk to you about, here is the stuff that is Promethean, and here's the other stuff. In Taoism, it's actually very much, they're very aware of this. And so they talk about that. I'll talk to you about that. And if you come in the seminar this weekend, I'll also be talking about that as well in the seminar. And that's one of the secrets of Taoism, by the way, that I'm going to share with you guys that you probably won't hear anywhere else from anybody else who claims to be a Taoist or who studies Taoism. So this is one of the secrets you're going to get in class, how Taoists view these things. Okay, so that's coming up later. All right. I don't know if I mentioned this a lot last time, but traditional Asian thought recognizes many paths to God, enlightenment, to the numinous, to the spiritual, whether that is some sort of transcendent Promethean idea where you're going to reach heaven or enlightenment or light up the dark through rationality, or whether or not it is just having a direct experience with that sort of unseen, more true reality that sort of is behind or above or hidden from our normal worldview. There's many ways to do this, and in Asian thought, there tends to be, and again, this is just a tendency, it's not absolute, there tends to be a little bit more acceptance of these different ways of getting at this sort of hidden, more truer reality. Okay? Some are very transcendent. Hinduism has lots of transcendent things. Some are not transcendent, like Taoism. And so we'll talk a bit about those. Okay? But the nice thing about this is that this allows a lot of positive psychology. You guys know what positive psychology is? You heard about this? this new movement now. It's become very popular, and we now have students going on to grad school out at Claremont and studying positive psychology. And this is the idea that you can take psychology. You know, we have a tradition of taking psychology and applying it to pathology. We like to pathologize things. You know, and you guys have all heard this story. I'm sure that, you know, you become a clinical psychology student in grad school, and pretty soon, first of all, you feel like you have everything that's in the DSM-4, DSM-5. You have everything in there. As soon as you read something, oh, God, I have that, right? And then you realize that, and then you start thinking like everybody's got a pathology, right? And you start labeling people by their pathologies. Everybody's pathological, right? Freud was really good about this. Freud, you know, really good at pathologizing people. So we have a long history of this, right? Everything is, you know, negative. Everybody's screwed up, right? Well, positive psychology looks to say, no, you know, look, maybe we're not all that screwed up. Maybe we're just kind of normal people, and really maybe one of the goals of psychology isn't just to get rid of the pathology. One of the goals of psychology can be to enhance our well-being. Maybe we're not screwed up, but we want to have a higher, you know, we want to feel better. We want to have a higher sense of well-being. We want to be more compassionate. We want to be, you know, whatever it might be. Pick your positive characteristic that we can enhance in ourselves. And positive psychology is about this. And one thing about Asian philosophy, and again, this is just a generalization, it's not always true, is that, you know, a lot of it is about enhancing our well-being. A lot of it's about positive psychology. And in fact, a lot of Asian traditions don't assume that we are full of pathologies. Or you could also say the converse is that, for instance, like in Buddhism, you can assume that we all have a pathology, that the human condition is a form of pathology. And so really what we're going to do is we're just going to try to enhance our well-being, you know, till we become enlightened, right? So this is a different emphasis. And what you'll find is in a lot of Asian traditions, there's not a whole lot of emphasis on treating psychopathology. And again, this is one of the last things I'll tell you at the end of the semester, but I'll reiterate it now, that these these things come to America, these Asian traditions come to America, and because we as Americans, as Westerners, have a lot of unmet psychological needs, we feel that we have lots of pathologies, we tend to look to these Asian traditions to fix us. And they're really not designed for that. It's not that the techniques can't be used in some case to help treat psychopathology. We'll see this in Buddhism. A lot of Western psychotherapies now are adopting this Buddhist mindfulness meditation as an adjunct to psychotherapy, and it seems to be very helpful to people. So it's not that the techniques aren't helpful, but that's not originally what they were designed for. The Buddha didn't come along and say, well, these people have antisocial personality disorders, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to design a meditation technique to cure them. That was not the intent. Okay, that was not the intent. And you'll see that with the rest of these psychopathologies. And one of the things is you have to realize these come out of societies that are very traditional, that are in a very different structure. People lived in a really quite different way than we live in the modern world. Whether you're talking about Asia or in the West, now, you know, Asia has been westernized enough that I think I can make this statement for pretty much everywhere in the world, that, you know, we don't live in the traditional way anymore. We don't live in small villages of 50 to 100 people where people, you know, did traditional things. We didn't get around, you know, by walking or by, you know, even horseback riding. You know, we zip around in cars nowadays. I want to go to LA, it just takes me an hour. You know, back in the day, it would have been, you know, maybe it was 2 days walk to go to Los Angeles, you know. And so now everything is faster. Our communication is instantaneous. I can pick up my phone and call somebody, you know, on the other side of the world and talk to them within a few seconds. This was unheard of just a few years ago. And when these traditions came about, there was no such thing as instantaneous communication. There was no such thing as getting from place to place. I couldn't just hop on a plane and within half a day be anywhere in the world. Right? Do you realize how amazing that is? That think of the most remote place in the entire world. You could literally hop on a plane and by tomorrow, you know, if you had enough money, by tomorrow you could be there. Or you get pretty close to it. If you want to get into the interior of New Guinea, well, you could get to New Guinea by tomorrow, but to get to the interior it may take you a little bit longer. It's still a hard place to get to, right? But you can get really most anywhere in the world within a day. I mean, it's amazing. So the way, and the communication is instantaneous. Something happens anywhere in the world, we know about it very quickly. We live in a different world. You want to contact anybody that you know, or almost anybody that you've ever known in your life, you just pick up your phone and you can go and, oh, I remember that guy, I knew him in third grade. Well, just look up in Facebook, there he is, contact him. I mean, it's amazing. When these things came about, these Asian traditions, and you could also extend this if we had a class on Western traditions as well, people weren't able to do the things that we're able to do. We just take these things for granted now, right? These traditions grew up, they were created in a different sort of environment. And so the way that they translate to modern times is something that we have to look at very carefully. Okay? Because some of these traditions are really adept at changing with the times. They're really good at adjusting for whatever's going on nowadays. Right, and so, and I would, in this case, I would have a bias. I would say Buddhism is a good example of this. We're in the midst of Buddhism changing from something that was around in, maybe 100 in the Common Era to something that now is existing in 2016 in the United States. Buddhism, because Buddhism is all about everything changes all the time. Right, so to walk the walk of Buddhism, you've got to be able to sort of roll with the punches and change. Right, so Buddhism, I think, is doing this. Other Asian traditions, I think, have a much harder time. Taoism, I think, has a much harder time adapting to the modern world. I think it's really difficult for Taoism to adapt. I think Taoism is having a tough time. Taoist practices have been adapted, but the view of Taoism, the core belief system, the core way that Taoists, back in the day understood their reality is really difficult to manifest, in my opinion, in modern times. Very difficult. So I think Taoism has a hard problem. Hinduism is all over the map, and we'll get to Hinduism. Hinduism is everything. What do you want Hinduism to be? I mean, because Hinduism is so broad and vast. But we also see Hinduism changing. I think I mentioned this last time, that in India, for instance, Hinduism is becoming very political now. Becoming a nationalist movement. It's being associated with that. So it's used for all sorts of things. So I'm going to reserve judgment about Hinduism. I'm going to keep studying it, and maybe someday I'll have a little understanding of it. Right? But it's really vast. So again, we see these things. They may not be so comfortable with how we exist and how we live in the world. And again, if you want to practice one of these religions or philosophies, it'll probably be incumbent on you to sort of adapt it to how you are living nowadays. And we also see this, by the way, those of you guys taking the 436 class, we also see this in the martial arts. It's very interesting how martial arts are adapting to the modern world. And in that class, I'll be talking about that as we move forward. And I talked a little bit about it last week, the sort of sport version of taking these martial arts that people initially used back in the day, to save their lives and save the lives of their families, now have become a sport that we watch as a spectacle. It's a huge change. And some of them adapt easily, and some is a very awkward fit. And I think we're going to see the same thing with the philosophies and the religions in here to some degree. Okay? All right. I will also talk to you about, and I'll be very biased about this, so let me be very upfront about this. When people have adopted Asian systems of Asian thought in a very superficial way, and they still have a Judeo-Christian Islamic worldview, but the trappings now, the outward trappings, have become something Asian. And this is something I don't like personally, and I see it all the time, and I see myself. It's very hard when you grow up in a Western culture to shed the viewpoint of the culture and be able to see through the eyes, figuratively, of a different viewpoint, especially one that comes from a place that's very, very different than where you grow up. And this is one of the reasons why I will encourage each and every one of you, when you get out of here, or before if you can, you should travel. Because I can tell you all day long about how Hindus view the world, but if you fly to India and get off the plane and hop in a cab and have the cab take you into the heart of an Indian city, and you get out and wander around, you're going to have a much greater experiential sense of the Hindu worldview. It's going to really feel very different. And I can tell you from experience of getting off a plane in India and just being in the middle of it and just feeling like it was as if I had gotten a spaceship and went to Mars and gotten off the spaceship and was walking around Martian society. It was that different. And it was a great experience, by the way. It's an awesome experience. And not only will it help you understand different worldviews, it will enlarge your perspective on everything in your life. And so one of the things I try to really encourage everybody in this class is to travel, because you will have no greater learning experience from a really experiential gut level than getting the hell out of here and going to a place where it's really, really, really different, especially where the culture is really different. And like India is a good example, right? India is crazy because, you know, people used to tell me to travel and they would say, you got to go to some place where people speak a different language. And that is a really interesting, great experience. Go to a place where you don't speak the language. That's a really interesting experience. But India, a lot of people speak English. It's the language of commerce in India. Everybody speaks English. And yet, even though they're speaking the same language, the thoughts are coming from a different place. And it's very different. And you'll have an experience of that. It's a wonderful experience. And I really, really would recommend that to you all. So if I can convince you when you get out of here to travel somewhere, I'll feel like I've done my job in this class. All right, so I want to now, I've been hedging around this idea here, and I think your question helped for this, is why is this a psychology class? Why a psychology class? Well, you know, I talked to you last time, you know, the basic reason why it's a psychology class is, let's be honest, I'm a psychology professor. I was in a position to teach whatever I wanted to teach when I got here, and so this is what I wanted to teach. So that's why this class is in the psychology program. So that's a sort of surface level answer which has a degree of veracity to it. Okay? The other reason, digging a little deeper, is because, I think I told you this before too, is that how I came to be interested in psychology was through Asian thought. I studied Asian thought first, and through that came to be interested in psychology. And the bridge for me was this idea of depth psychology. Okay, a psychological system that also sees that there's some sort of underlying reality to our sort of consensus reality, our everyday reality that we have. And this idea to me has been very, very appealing. And very appealing in psychology because we think about how humans behave, but we can also think about what motivates that behavior. What motivates that behavior. So if one thing you could think about this class is, it's a class about motivational psychology. What motivates us to behave a certain way? What motivates us to think a certain way? And one thing is, in Asian thought and in depth psychology, the idea that there's something that we're not aware of, some kind of reality, some kind of space that we're not aware of that motivates us, that depth psychologists would call the unconscious. And that our motivation comes from this thing that we're not generally conscious of. And that the work of psychology is to make, as Freud said very famously, make the unconscious conscious. This is essentially, again, I'm generalizing, but this is essentially what we also have in traditional Asian thought. This idea that we're going to make the unconscious conscious. And I'm hoping you're hearing your Promethean idea there, right? This is a Promethean idea. So I am going to use as the Jungians would say, Mercury just entered the room. We're going to use this idea of making the unconscious conscious, okay, as the lens that we understand the stuff in this class. Okay, this is not necessarily the lens that traditional Asian thought would apply to themselves. Okay, making the unconscious conscious. They might say, no, we're not going to try to do that. What we're going to try to do is steep ourselves in this unconscious. And we're just going to live there for a while and experience it, and we don't need to make it conscious, we just need to have an experience of it. But since it's the psychology class, since we're Westerners, since we have a tradition of analysis, a Promethean tradition of analysis, of making the dark light, then the lens that we'll use will be to do this, to try to make the unconscious conscious. And so one thing that we'll look in these Asian traditions is we'll look and see, to some degree, how they view this underlying reality, this unconscious that we're going to label it in the West, and then how this motivates people. And we'll see some interesting parallels and interesting parallels with Western psychology, with depth psychology, and we'll also see some interesting detours, I think, that you'll find fascinating as well. Why do I talk about depth psychology in this class? Because it's psychology that I know. I think it has this similar outlook, and the other reason I think depth psychology, in my opinion, is somewhat ignored in academia. And so I also see this as a chance, an excuse to teach you a little bit about Freud, teach you a little bit about Jung, when you're not really going to get much of that anywhere else in your education here. So I'm going to be a little bit, tiny bit subversive and sneak this stuff in on you guys. Now, I think I mentioned this before as well. We could have talked about a lot of it. We could talk about behaviorism. And I could talk about, some of these psychologies, some of these Asian traditions in terms of behaviorism. Buddhism is a great example of that. Buddhism has a whole very behavioral-like system of understanding human psychology that's included in here. We could talk about, obviously, Western psychology, fMRI machines and scanning people's brains and brain physiology. The Dalai Lama has been sponsoring a lot of studies to do this now. It's been a big deal, and he's really into this. And there are whole conferences now on neuroscientists getting together and talking about Buddhist practices, Buddhist meditation, these kind of things. Dr. Key knows some of those people, by the way, if you're interested in that. You can talk to her about that. But we're not going to really dwell much on that in this class. We're going to spend most of the time letting the systems of Asian thought speak for themselves. And we can do that because many of them have their own system of psychology built in. It's going to be maybe a little more geared toward positive psychology, but it is a psychological system nevertheless. And these psychological systems they've been around for a long time, they've been very well worked out. In many cases, they also have, might put in quotations, psychotherapeutic exercises. Again, these aren't geared at curing specific pathologies necessarily, but they are more geared at enhancing your well-being, but nevertheless, they are like psychotherapies. They have some common ground with psychotherapy. And so we don't really actually, to teach a psychology class on Asian thought, we actually really don't need to bring in any Western psychology whatsoever. We could just say we're going to just explore the psychology of these systems themselves. But I will bring in Freud and Jung because I think it's a good bridge. And it helps us keep this sort of comfortable Western, dare you say, Promethean viewpoint. We can keep that as a sort of a lens that we look through these things. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions about that? I don't want to disappoint anybody if you thought you were going to learn about fMRI machines and meditators' brains lighting up. I can give you the punchline already. 10,000 hours of meditation, pleasure centers of your brain light up permanently. Less than 10,000 hours, you proportionally less pleasure center lighting up, but still does light up with less meditation. So we really have physiological evidence now that meditation is very helpful to us. Okay, so that's the long and the short of it. There's a lot more detail if you look into some of these studies. And those of you interested in that stuff, I really would encourage you to talk to Dr. Key about that, since she does a lot of fMRI studies. And that's something we've had a lot of students go over and do internships and things like that, doing these kind of, not with meditators, more likely with schizophrenics, but you can do these fMRI studies. And it's something that some of you guys may go on to graduate school to do. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit of the basics of Freud and Jung. Okay? But before I do that, I want to talk about another term that you will probably not have heard in your education here. And this term, metapsychology. Metapsychology. Well, that's a fancy word. What does metapsychology mean? Metapsychology. I love this. Because if I think if I'd known this word when I was younger, I would have said, this is really what I'm going to be studying. Not psychology per se, but I'm going to study metapsychology. And I think over the years, if you looked at things I'm interested in, if I look at things I'm interested in, I would say probably metapsychology has been my primary interest. The branch of theoretical or speculative psychology that deals with the significance of mental processes, not dealing necessarily with the mental processes themselves, but their significance to us as human beings. In other words, we step back, take one step back from mental processes and look at, see what is the significance and relevance of these mental processes to us, to our lives as human beings. The nature of the mind-body relationship, the origin, purpose, structure of the mind, and similar hypotheses that are beyond the realm of empirical verification. I disagree with this last part. I think that some of these things may not have been empirically verified yet, but I think that it's very possible that some of them can become empirically verified. And again, I will point to the Dalai Lama and his study of meditators as somebody who's trying to do this. They're taking some kind of meta-psychology, they're looking at these mental processes, the significance of these things, and they're now able to scientifically observe some of these things. So, and then when you observe them, the question between mental processes and significance of mental process, there's a little bit of a gray area there. But I'm thinking that I don't know if these are all beyond the realm of empirical verification. Many of them may be right now, but in the future that could change. Okay. Here's another quote. The study of the origin, structure, and function of the mind and the relationship between the mind or spirit and the physical universe. It picks up where psychology as the science of behavior leaves off. Hence the name metapsychology is the correct connotation of being a study that goes beyond psychology, beyond the study of behavior, to the study of that which behaves. Beyond the study of behavior to the study of that which behaves. In other words, the human being who's doing the behavior. I like this. Those of you guys who know me know that sometimes here and sometimes over at Cal Lutheran in the graduate school, I offer a class on existential psychology. And existential psychology also follows this distinction here and is in a sense a meta-psychology, because existential psychology really focuses on the person doing the behaving, not the behavior. And it's a different focus, very interesting way of looking at things. I won't talk too much about existentialism in here because I don't want to have your heads explode. But I might mention it a little bit especially when we talk about Buddhism, because there's a lot of similarities between existentialism and Buddhism. And in fact, some of the great existentialist thinkers got a lot of ideas from Buddhism. They cribbed a lot off Buddhism. If we had time, we'd go into some of that stuff. It's really quite interesting. But it is kind of like a meta-psychology, so I like this idea. Okay? The person themselves and the person's perceptual, conceptual, and creative activity is distinguished from the actions of his or her body. In this sense, meta-psychology restores the original meaning of psychology as the study of soul or spirit. Psyche means soul or spirit or those kind of things. And the applications of meta-psychology reflect a perennial common goal of both therapy and religion, whether one calls this goal the attainment of sanity, of enlightenment, or happiness, or of salvation. Okay, so this is the idea that you're doing psychotherapy for your well-being, right? Psychotherapy in a positive psychology sense, which I like. Okay? So think about this. We think about the word psychology. Psyche meaning soul or spirit. And then we'll think about some of the other terms we're going to talk about in this class, because each of these Asian traditions has an analogous term. Okay? So in Hinduism, we might talk about, I'm blanking on it for a second. For Taoism, we might talk about qi, right? It's this sort of energy that animates the body. Tibetan Buddhism, we'll talk about lung. Hinduism, we'll talk about, I'm blanking on the Hindu one now. Prana, thank you. Prana. Ancient Greeks, we could talk about pneuma. These all have similar connotations to the word psyche. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is, all these other words from Eastern religions also have a connotation with breath and breathing. And I don't know that psyche has that same connotation. That'd be something interesting to study. But this idea that soul, spirit, some animating energy that we have as human beings. And then in some of these traditions also, you find these things not just in human beings, but in the animal world, in the physical world as well. So for Taoism, you can say a person has a certain chi, you could say a rock has certain chi, you could say a country has a certain type of chi. In Hinduism, I believe some branches of Hinduism, you can also say the same thing about prana, that, that there's a prana, that energy, that the world is alive, has some animating energy. And again, if you want to make some correlations with modern physics, there are some nice, interesting correspondences here. So this is what we're going to do. So we're going to look at Freud and Jung, and we're going to think of these in a metapsychological way. Okay? We could do the otherwise. I could teach a class here on psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and we could just look at behavior and processes and unconscious things going on, and less of the significance and more of the application. How to apply this. Somebody comes in, they've got a neuroses, or they've got they're diagnosed with depression or something. How are we going to work with that person and treat them? That's the more of the psychological application. Here we're going to really be talking more about the metapsychology. Depth psychology, and by depth psychology I mean the psychologies of Freud and Jung for the most part. I would also probably include some existential psychologies in that. I might include some aspects of the psychologies by offshoots of Freud like Adler, maybe some other people. But really, we think about Freud and Jung. Their psychologies lend themselves to this sort of metapsychological viewpoint. So we're going to start with Freud and psychoanalysis. And the distinguishing feature of psychoanalysis is something called psychodynamics. Okay? And psychodynamics is the study of thoughts, impulses, drives, emotions, experiences, and defense mechanisms that explain how the mind functions and adapts. Okay? So the movement of these things within the mind. Dynamics. Dynamic means movement. And by the way, this is a picture of Freud's consulting room. And Dr. Freud would sit in his chair facing this way. You would go into his room, you would lie in this couch facing away from him, and he would have you do a technique called free association, where you would lie on the couch and you would free associate, which means you would just talk about whatever comes to your mind. And the idea, and the room would be a little bit dark, you might be looking at some paintings or some sort of nondescript things, and the idea was that this would engender your mind to, your unconscious mind to come forward. And you could express a lot of your unconscious doing this. Especially as you become more comfortable, you lie on the couch, you sit back, say whatever comes into your mind, and then a lot of your unconscious stuff will come out. The other place that unconscious stuff comes out is in dreams. And I'll talk to you a little bit later about the way Freudians look at dreams and the way Jungians look at dreams. The dreams are also thought by Freud and Jung to be the royal road to the unconscious. Okay, so the way you get at unconscious stuff, your bridge to the unconscious, your bridge to this other alternative reality is through dreaming. Okay, so this is a technique here, free association on the couch, and then also dream analysis, looking at your dreams. And there's a long tradition of this. There's a tradition of this that goes back to the ancient Greeks. You go to the temple of Asclepius. I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, I'm sorry. The Asclepian temples, something was like the god of medicine, and you would have an illness or something going on, and you would go to the temple, and for your treatment, what would you do in the temple? You would go in the temple, and you would sleep at the temple, and you would dream. And your dreams would give you a key to what was going on with you, and then the idea would be also a key to how you would be cured. The gods would come to you in the dream and provide you with medicine. Okay, and so again, even among the ancient Greeks, we could see this sort of idea that dreams are this path into this other world, and that this coming into contact with this unconscious is something that can be quite healing. Okay, now the Freudians tend to be a little more look at this dealing with pathologies. The Jungians tend to look at this as more dealing with enhancing well-being, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that later. So, drive theories. And both Freud and Jung were drive theorists, essentially that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors arise from internal drives. Okay? Problems may arise when drives conflict with one another or with demands of family society. In the case of Jung, our collective programming. I'll get to that in a minute. But this drive, the idea that you have a drive, that there's something that motivates you, something from your unconscious motivates you. And for Freud, of course, this also has to do with your physiology. Okay, these drives are physiologically based. Okay, they're physiologically based. They have something to do with they're unconscious. You don't recognize them, but they have something to do with your biology or physiology. And I will say, in that sense, since they have something to do with your biology and physiology, I will further add the overlay that these also have something to do with our evolutionary past as human beings. That we have certain internal biological motivating drives because these conferred survival value upon our ancestors way back in the day. And so these things tend to stick with us. Okay? And I'll talk to you about these. By the way, this is an interesting picture. This is a picture of both Freud here and his young adept colleague Jung here when they came to Clark University in 1909 to give lectures. And this was the interesting beginning of the breakup of their bromance. I love to use that word, bromance. They were on a steamship traveling from Europe to America, and on the steamship they thought to pass the time, because remember back in the day, even just not too long ago, you couldn't just fly from Europe to here in a day. You had to get on a steamship and go on a big boat, and it took like a week to go from Europe to the east coast of America. And so to pass the time, they thought they would analyze each other's dreams. And so Jung gave Freud a bunch of dreams, and Freud analyzed those dreams, and then Jung said, okay, give me some of your dreams, and Freud said, no. And Jung said, what do you mean? Let's analyze each other's dreams. That's what we're going to do. And Freud said, no, I have to maintain my position of authority, so I don't want you analyzing my dreams. And Jung, being a rebellious young man, this has started, hooked his father complex, his Oedipal complex, and this was the start of the start of the end of their relationship. If you watch the movie The Most Dangerous Method, which is a very interesting movie, it's about Freud and Jung. They also add in the movie that they go to the steamship, and Freud, not being a rich man, books basically a nice second-class cabin, just above the steerage on the inside of the boat, in a tiny little cramped space. Jung, having married into a considerable amount of wealth, his wife books him a cabin, and of course she books him a first-class suite up on the top deck overlooking out the ocean. And this is something that Freud realizes, this class difference, and one of the thoughts is that there was possibly some jealousy on Freud's part about Jung's wealth. I don't know if that's substantiated or not, but it's certainly in the movie. It's a good scene in the movie. I recommend that movie, by the way. It's a very interesting movie. We'll talk a little more about that later. We also have neo-analytic theories, which I'm not going to talk to you a whole lot about in this class, but just so that you know about that, we take Freud's ideas of drives, and and these theorists came along later and says, well, you really don't need these drives, really. You can just talk about the need of human beings to have relationships with one another. And, thoughts, feelings, behaviors are really, they're not driven by these biological things. They're really driven by the need for attachment to other people. Okay? And when those needs are not met, you have problems, and this is where you get this modern area of attachment theory. And again, this is sort of the academic way that if you live in academia and you want to study Freudian stuff, you can study it under the guise of attachment theory. You can study these ideas, and you don't have to mention the F word, right? The F word is Freud. Academicians seem to have an allergy to Freud for some reason, so you do attachment theory instead. And Dr. Baker is an expert on attachment theory. If you're interested in attachment theory, I recommend talking to him. But this idea that you don't need a drive, these guys are kind of offshoots of Freud, that you don't really need drives. There's just a need for attachment. Now, from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. There's nothing wrong with attachment theory. From an evolutionary standpoint, we know that among primates, live in social groups. If a primate is raised without a mother, or as those Harry Harlow experiments with a wire mother, that the offspring will have lots of problems. They will not develop properly. And so we know that, there's a biological need for attachment. Why would we have this biological need for attachment? Because it confers survival value. So those of our ancestors who remained attached basically had more offspring than those who did not. And so we now have inherited this sort of need for attachment. And that's served us very well as human beings. We've done pretty well as far as still being around after, so many thousands, hundred thousands, maybe millions of years. But we have this. So you can think of a good evolutionary reason for attachment. It confers survival value. So of course this makes sense. Now, if you want to be sort of a modern but standard Freudian person, you could say, well, that's fine. We do have these needs for attachment, but these needs for attachment arise out of our basic drives. I'll talk about those in a minute. So, depending how closely you toe the line to the Freudian orthodoxy, you can either throw out the drives like these guys, or you can keep them in there, but you can still have in there this need for attachment. I tend to be in the latter camp. I think the drives make a lot of sense, but I also see this need for attachment as being something very relevant. But the need for attachment, in my opinion, grows out of the other drives, that those are related to one another. I don't think you need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But they're all important. The bottom line is they're all important. Now, what about Freud and Asian philosophy and religions? Freud did not study Asian philosophy and religions. He was not really that interested in what was going on in the East. Very interestingly enough, during the time of Freud, you also have other Germanic scholars who become very, very interested in Asia and in the East. And so, but Freud, that was not his deal. I think he was more of a guy who was, looking to do something that was dealing with pathology. Eastern ideas were not something on his radar. He did refer to something he called the nirvana principle. Excuse me. But in Freud's thought, this was seen as a return to pleasure through a reduction of excitation, and not a real understanding of what the term nirvana means. Later on, he revised this to include pleasure induced through an increase in excitation. So these are very different than the Buddhist idea of nirvana. Okay, so he had a kind of pop psychology version of nirvana, really had anything to do with Buddhism. Okay? Nirvana, we will learn a little bit later on, refers to literally, the literal translation is the blowing out of a candle or an encounter with non-duality. So very different than the way Freud looked at things. Now, Jung, on the other hand, made significant forays into the study of Asian philosophy and religion. He wrote insightful introductions into the Taoist text, The Secret of the Golden Flower, and the Tibetan Buddhist text, The Bardo at the Dole. He also wrote an introduction to the Taoist text, the I Ching. Jung was able to demonstrate the universality of many of his ideas, like the collective unconscious and archetypes, which we'll talk about later, through the study of these texts. However, what he didn't do is he looked at these texts from these other cultures, from Asian thought, and he saw his own ideas reflected in those texts. What he did not do was look at those texts and see the ideas in those texts on their own in some unique way, and then apply those to his psychology. So he had a very, I would say, one-pointed, one-direction look into Asian thought as a way of sort of validating his ideas, not the other way around. Okay, and this is very important. And again, when you look at depth psychologists who look at Asian thought, this is something that you see. Okay, even if they're looking at the universality of things. Like, look, here we see in the Western culture, we see there's a trickster, there's a hero. We also see it in Asian culture too. See those things over there? Oh, they're all universal, right? Well, that may be true, but this is denying or what's the word I want to use? Making the Asian stuff not as important. The idea that the Asian systems of thought do not have something on their own that's unique to them that they can offer to Western psychology is somewhat absent definitely from Jung's work. And I would include people who come after Jung. I would include Joseph Campbell in this. That they're not necessarily the uniqueness of things that come out of Asian thought. Or if they talk about the uniqueness, they might say it's unique, but then they don't really engage with that or explicate that to then enlighten the rest of the universal things that are also from the West. Okay? And again, this is not a criticism, because this is, you look at people like Jung, you look at people like Joseph Campbell, and Joseph Campbell, by the way, is a guy, mythologist, who really drew from both Freud and Jung. You know, he didn't have any tribal ties to one camp or the other. He was really happy to draw from both traditions, but he's a Westerner, and so he is really looking at the sort of the structure of mythology as a Western person looking at it, and that's fine. We don't really expect that from him, but we do not want to say that he explicates. At least I wouldn't say that he explicates Eastern traditions from the viewpoint of these Asian traditions. Okay, he's not expressing that. He's not expressing necessarily the uniqueness of the Asian traditions and what they have to offer Western psychology. Joseph Campbell probably doing a little bit of that, but that's not the main thrust. And certainly with Jung, we don't see much of that. Jung is a guy who got on a steamship to travel to India, and when he got to India, he stayed on the boat the whole time. So he puts the toe in the water of Asian thought, but he does not jump in for a swim. Let's put it that way. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Nevertheless, Jung's forays of engaging these Buddhist and Taoist texts is incredibly important for this class and for our beginning to bring these traditions to the awareness of people in the West, and especially the awareness of psychologists. And I owe these Jungian texts to my becoming a psychologist. I would never have in a million years thought about going into psychology if I hadn't read Jung doing these right, especially the Tibetan book of the dead, the Bard of the Dole. That was very instrumental in my becoming interested in psychology. There's no way I would have been a fish biologist somewhere, working in a fish hatchery. I wouldn't have gotten interested in psychology at all. This was the gateway drug for me. So, so personally, I feel a great debt to Jung for having done this, and I think these works are incredibly important to read. And you guys are going to be reading some of these things at Jung. I think I have some readings for you. Okay. And Jung was able to really look at many of his ideas, like the collective unconscious and archetypes, through the study of these texts, and seeing that these texts not only applied to things from the West, but also applied from things to the East. And this is very important. Okay, this is very useful and important.